Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again to the airwaves of Salam Media. It is Wednesday night. The time is just gone. 7 minutes past 9 p.m. I am Inayat Wadi. Will be hosting the panel discussion on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi. Now, the major talking point right across the entire globe has been Russia and Ukraine. And last week, the world woke up to a new reality, but a reality that should not surprise us. It has been a reality that has been taking place for a very, very long time, for well over 150 years. A reality that the world is right now focused on. We've forgotten about the pandemic. COVID-19 is no longer a major talking point, and the attention of the world is now focused on what is termed as the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And there has been so much talk in the last week. We've seen so much happening. We've seen Russia, we've seen the troops, obviously, in Ukraine. We've seen people fleeing by the thousands, and we've seen all sorts of analysis coming through as well. And this is what we intend doing tonight, looking at the geopolitical dynamics that are playing out and the geopolitical analysis of the crisis in Ukraine. Now, we've got part of the panel, we've got an independent political analyst in the form of Dr. Maxim Rozumyi, who is from Ukraine. We've got Botseng Moiloa, who is an independent political analyst, Ashraf Patel, researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and Maurice Lacan, Washington, D.C. human rights activist. So we've assembled quite a panel this evening to take us through this discussion on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi. Now, I see some of the panelists have come on. I see Dr. Maxim has joined us as well. To all of you, Ashraf Patel, firstly, top of the screen, Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Ashraf, if you could unmute your mic, please.
Walaikum salam to Brother Inayat.
Sorry, something wrong with connection. I don't see.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum Inayat and listeners. How are you?
Yes, doing very well. I see Botseng Moiloa looking handsome as ever. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Inayat, Brother Inayat, and good evening to the fellow panelists, and very good evening to your viewers as well as your listeners. Thank you.
And also to Al-Hajj Maurice Lacan. Assalamu alaikum to you and welcome. Okay, I see Al-Hajj Maurice Lacan has disappeared. Okay, we're going to start off with you, and obviously we're going to try and unpack some of the issues with regard to this crisis between Russia and Ukraine. And the key issue here is the geopolitical analysis of the Ukraine crisis. Now, we woke up, as I mentioned in my introduction, we woke up to a new reality last week. But I mentioned that this is a reality that shouldn't surprise us, because when one looks at the global dynamics that have been playing out for a very, very long time today, and also trying in terms of trying to unpack the latest developments, we're talking about the dangers of military escalation, which are beyond description. And at this point in time, just your analysis. Firstly, are you surprised that Russia has now invaded Ukraine, and also trying to understand what some of the underlying issues would be?
Thanks, Inayat. First of all, I am not surprised at all. This has long been coming. For those who follow the politics of that particular region and have observed the behavior of NATO in the last 7 to 8 years, and some people are saying it runs to 9 years, you will see and notice how actually Russia has been very concerned about the conduct of NATO within its neighboring states and the former USSR republics. In the last, say, 10 to 15 years, NATO has expanded a lot in that region, and the former USSR member states have joined NATO, which is correct in the choice of independent and sovereign states. But one thing that I will unpack this evening, and I'm going to leave that out through these introductory remarks, it's how Russia continuously and consistently over the last, say, 10 to 12 years have raised their concern about the NATO expansion, not only due to the membership, but mainly due to American-led NATO forces expanding their presence within the borderline of Russia and the neighboring states like Ukraine, and particularly with Ukraine. Moscow has been engaging, NATO member states have been engaging their neighbors. They've spoken to the USA, and has been diplomatic engagement between Moscow and the countries that I've mentioned to say we do not have a problem as Moscow in our former, brothers and sisters joining multilateral organization of their choice, but we have a problem when the expansion of NATO, particularly the USA, armament, military, nuclear weapons, and military bases are expanding right within our noses and our borderline. I will come to that later on, but the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, it doesn't come as a surprise to me. We have seen the build up towards this. I personally think Ukraine was misled by the West, particularly the USA, to say refuse to cooperate with Russia and therefore will support you to Russia try to invade you. Nobody ever imagined that Russia will ever do it, but for me, it doesn't come as a surprise in it.
Thank you very much for that, Botsang. And Ashraf, just to bring you into the discussion, and as you've heard from Botsang, it doesn't come as a surprise. This thing was long coming. Central to this entire saga that is playing out has been NATO. And we know with the eastward expansion of NATO has become problematic as far as Russia is concerned. And this is what Vladimir Putin is actually saying, that looking at it from a Russian perspective, this has been his major concern, the NATO expansion eastwards. Ashraf, if you could unmute, please.
Yes, thank you for that, Inayat. Yes, I do concur with largely with Botsang's assessment. And to give it a much more broader historical context, if one recall that during the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in the years regarding the war on terror, the discourse was very much a kind of clash of civilizations. This war has some elements of that, in a sense that you're having the West, let's call it the Judeo-Christian West, essentially anchored around the United States, UK, and mainstream Europe. And then you have anchored in Russia and some of the states, you have a Eurasian kind of world civilization, if you like, where Russia sees itself as part of a broader Eurasia that's looking east. And for 2 decades or so, this kind of discourse and, if you like, division has been rooted in a broader a clash of values, where the Eurasian view or the Russian view is that since the end of the Cold War and then the rise of globalization or Western-centric globalization, there has been a misunderstanding, a major misunderstanding of what it means for the West. When the Cold War ended, it was basically a green light for a unipolar world anchored around the US. And that has given them almost carte blanche to incorporate East Europe into the Western system. And that one can see the gradual incorporation of countries like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, etc., into the EU as a centerpiece of that understanding. Now, when it comes to countries like Ukraine, it was always sort of in between. Do they look east? Do they look west? What is the kind of view, noting that they have a large, significant Russian-speaking population, but also a very strong history with the old USSR? I think within that context and the kind of decline of the US, particularly in the last few years, particularly after the Syrian and Libyan and expeditions, and now the Afghanistan withdrawal, the US is vulnerable because of massive expenditures and failures in Middle East. It's now was pivoting towards the East or Eurasia. And somehow Ukraine got caught in all of this as a strategic geopolitical state that must confront this new Eurasia. And sadly enough, this is what we have today. I'm just giving that kind of background to open the discussion.
Yes, I've taken note of what you've just said. Botsang, I think what is also important for us to understand is to look at what the Western media is saying at this point in time. Obviously, apart from the NATO issue, which is central, I agree. But the question of serving national interests above international law, and that seems to be featuring very, very prominently. And we need to understand and we need to be clear about this issue, because we've seen the West, we've seen the likes of the United States of America, who will put their own interests first. And by using NATO, and as you had mentioned, and we've seen even the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, talking about this, saying that they want guarantees from me, but they can't guarantee my security by placing NATO right next door to my home.
Sir, you are correct. You know, we will recall as international citizens that as way back as the mid 80s, the former Cuban president, late President Fidel Castro, had warned the world about the expansion and the growth and the intentions of NATO. What NATO is doing today, to some of us, it's not a surprise that it is actually a prototype kind of tool that is being used by the United States of America to can actually control and or manage young member states of the United Nations organizations who are coming up and enticing them to belong to an organization like NATO, which its intention is nothing else but war. If you look at the existence of NATO, it has nothing to do actually with trade and economy and all that. It has everything to do with invading as well as interfering with domestic, politics of various member states that belongs to them. And the USA has used NATO. Unfortunately, they've used them for their own domestic benefit. And as you have said earlier on, it is international politics vis-a-vis domestic politics. And NATO has been a very good platform to be used by America, which is a very militant state. We have seen how the USA has used NATO in advancing towards Iraq, in advancing towards and occupying and dismantling Libya, in doing that to Syria to some extent, Yemen, and so forth. We have seen that unfolding over the years. And coincidentally, in this instance, they were doing it towards a UN member state who is also a member of the Security Council, Russia, that is aware of the conduct and the behavior of the USA towards young member states when it comes to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. But I think time has come whereby various countries of the UN, which has been silent in this instance, they have decided not to let the USA abuse its influence, its status within NATO in order to can interfere with the domestic affairs or regional affairs of other countries. We know that the USA is sitting with military, presence in Kenya. They are present in Botswana, in Yemen, and other countries, Kuwait, and so forth. And if you look at how they operated over the years, everywhere in a small country like Kuwait, Kenya, Botswana, where they start a military base, it's actually leads to a war within that particular region. Fortunately, with us in the southern region, in the bottom part of Africa, we haven't been in that situation, except in the Great Lakes, where they had to occupy the DRC in order to can start wars and battles and things like informing as well as funding insurgents and rebels within the region. But fortunately in SADC, we've been fortunate that they haven't used those bases to invade and or influence politics of regional blocks. However, Russia has come up now to say we cannot tolerate this. We know the behavior and the conduct of the United States of America, supported by France and the Great Britain, and therefore we are not going to allow that anymore. But something very important, you mentioned domestic politics, whether Ukraine does not care about its civilians, its citizens. You have also mentioned about the reporting in the media, which is biased. We know that the RT has been banned in various platforms. We know that the BBC, CNN, to some extent, Al Jazeera and other Western medias have primarily since last week Thursday's reported lies. They started showing visuals of old photos, even the print media, of old photos with battles in Ukraine. They've started talking about how Russia is going to kill civilians in Ukraine. And we haven't seen that happening. Russia has been focusing on the military basis, on where there's military strength within Ukraine. And I personally think it is actually the Republic of Ukraine that has put its citizens at risk by arming civilians in order to protect and defend their country against a military invasion. Now, how does a leader of a country use civilians to protect against a military invasion? The military that hasn't started even attacking civilian platforms or towns or what. So that's one of the things we must guard against. But I said to somebody yesterday and this morning, a war is never a good thing, and nobody wants to be in a war situation. However, what I proudly can sit here and say, the Russian state had all the powers, all the military arsenal to could have started bombing, to could have started destroying Ukraine. And I think President Vladimir Putin and his cabinet, they have been thought or apply their minds in destroying Ukraine. I don't think the intention here is destroying Ukraine like what NATO and the US does. When NATO and the US move into a place, they destroy. They destroy infrastructure, they cut water supply, they cut gas, and they frustrate the civilians of a particular country and destroy it completely. Then they send their economic arsenal to come and rebuild that country to make money for them. For the last 6 days of these happenings in the Balkan states and all that, we haven't seen Russia actually, conducting any attack on any civilians. There will be casualties in any war, but we haven't even seen Russia going for soft targets, whereby residential areas, schools, churches, or mosques are being bombed or destroyed by forces of Russia that have occupied the major towns of Ukraine. So those are some of the things we should be paying attention to say the foreign or Western-based or influenced media has been misleading people who don't have access to information. They have banned and cut off media houses that are differing with them, and we should guard against that. The people must be told the truth. The world must know the truth that where we are sitting today, the Western media was reporting attacks on Ukraine 2 days before the attacks even started. And even after, they're not reporting lack of attacks on civilians and civilian destinations. And we know that is common cause. In a war situation, you will first attack the military barracks, you will occupy the airspace, you will attack the communication. That's what Russia has done in this sense. I don't think Russia has any intention or whatsoever to can destroy infrastructure and civilian lives in Ukraine. And that's my standing at the moment.
Thank you for that, Botsang. I see Al-Haj Maurice Al-Khan has joined us. Assalamu alaikum to you, Al-Haj.
Walaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Yes, welcome. And I believe Dr. Maxim is on the phone with us. Dr. Maxim Rudumyi is an independent political analyst. Dr. Maxim, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Have a nice evening.
Yes, Dr. Maxim, I'd like to bring you into the discussion now. I know you've joined us a bit late, but you obviously... in Ukraine, and you've written extensively with regard to democracy in Ukraine, and also at the same time looking at what has been playing out over the years as far as Russia is concerned, as far as NATO is concerned. And some of the analysts that we have been talking to have been obviously talking about NATO, which is basically central to this conflict, and even looking at compromising the Russian security as a result of NATO. And I'd just like your thoughts, your initial thoughts on how you see this conflict and how do you see what is termed by the Western media as Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Well, thank you for the possibility to express my opinion. What was announced about our discussion, it must be geopolitical analysis. So let me start from the main goals and interests of the big players in this game. firstly, we must look at the Russia, at the Putin goals and interests. I think that NATO, the problem of NATO, the problem of Western threats against Russia, to security of Russia, it's a false flag. It's not a real problem for the Putin. Because Ukraine hasn't a perspective to be member of NATO in closest 10 or 20 years. It's obviously for Ukrainians and for Russians as well. It's just a figure of Russian propaganda to say that they protected from NATO during this aggression against Ukraine. The real goal, actual goal of Putin in this war is another. Now Russia is on the top of its power possibilities because the next period must be there must be losing of markets of oil or gas and losing of innovation and so on. So the potential of Russia will decrease anyway. But now Putin trying to close his country as North Korea or Iran, and he's interested to make mess around his empire. And the main goal of attack against Ukraine is not to occupy, is not to control Ukraine, it's just to destroy Ukraine. That's the geopolitical goal. But this goal is connected very close to the inner political goals of Putin inside Russia. The only way to keep power forever for him and for his team is to close his country, to make it like North Korea or Iran. And in this case, if he destroyed Ukraine, he can do it just under the pressure of West, and he can explain to Russian people that what happened with Russia, why they must be closed in the small empire, and the wider space, I mean post-Soviet space, in this pattern, in this model of geopolitical game. This wider space must be destroyed with weak state and with few people and just strong empire inside of this space. I mean Russian empire. It's a game of Putin. Another game we can see from Western side. It's very specific game. There are not only one goal in this game. Your speakers mentioned already the attacks of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and so on. So now, when Putin attacked Ukraine, the most of people all around the world can forget about these cases and see the main evil in the world, which they can see on the TV screen. But what's the point? What the point of Ukraine? What the role of Ukraine in this game? I don't want to believe that West decided to sacrifice Ukraine, but it looks like this attack of Russia it's similar to make Ukraine is something like trap for the predator. At the moment, it looks like that, and we will see in next week, maybe next 2 weeks, if the West will catch this predator, if they decided to survive, to save victims, and what will happen then? The geopolitical map of world of this region of world, in the result of this game, will be we can see two variants. We can see divided Europe, as previously as in the time of Cold War, divided Europe.
Yeah. Dr. Maxim, can I just stop you there? Obviously, that is an area that we're going to be exploring as well, because one of the issues that has obviously emerged from this is the Cold War, and are we looking at a Cold War scenario? But it is clear that what is taking place at this point in time has got major global implications and major global consequences. And I'd just like to bring Alhaj Maurice Khan into the discussion. Now, obviously, the United States of America central to this as well. And we've heard about this being no hidden secret, Alhaj Maurice Khan, that the Western nations of Europe and the United States of America have invented this international crisis to serve their own narrow national interests. We heard today where we've seen the United States representative to the United Nations make it very, very clear, telling the United Nations that it is your job, it is your responsibility to ensure that there is peace in the world. And as Dr. Maxim alluded to previously, speaking about countries like Afghanistan, about Iraq, but where was the United States nations at that point in time? Why did the United States not give the very same message to the United Nations at that point in time as well? Now, this obviously tells us that there is a bigger picture. There is, as Dr. Maxim mentioned, there are games being played. And this game is also being played very well by the United States of America.
No doubt it is. And from our humble perspective, there are really no honest brokers on any side of this crisis. And, especially when it comes to the country that likes to view itself as the only remaining superpower in the globe, the United States of America. There really aren't any honest brokers. I sent, because this issue is being discussed and debated here in the public square, in social media, in various areas of public life, as it is in other parts of the world. And my concern, as is always the case when it comes to really hot button controversial issues of a socio-political nature, is to help my brothers and sisters to navigate to the best of my ability and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide my heart and my mind, help us collectively navigate these controversial shoals as effectively as we possibly can. I released a piece of Nasihas, some sincere advice around this issue a couple of days ago, and I'd like to begin with a sharing of what I had to say on the Russian versus Ukrainian et al. Crisis, just as food for thought. I wrote the following: Muslims in the West, speaking to my brothers and sisters, my friends and family and associates here in the United States of America, and other parts of the West, the UK, etc. Muslims in the West, their leaders and organizations must learn to engage in a far more deliberative process of assessment before taking positions on any controversial matter, be it local, national, or international. The current European crisis is a case in point. Far too often, we, like others, tend to blindly come down on the side of where we perceive our alliances or allegiances and or our interests to be. And as is often the case, there are no honest or clean brokers on either side of a geopolitical crisis. Ukrainian President Zelensky is a Zionist who has served as an apologist and supporter of apartheid Israel in its suppression of our Palestinian brothers and sisters. It is also worth noting that contingents of the Ukrainian military have reportedly served as part of US-led NATO's so-called war on terrorism in Iraq and in other theaters of conflict in the quote-unquote Muslim world. On the other side, Putin and Russia have also wrought untold misery on Muslim populations in furtherance of their geopolitical agenda. So when it comes to the Muslim world, there are no clean hands on either side. With that being said, an objective assessment of the current crisis suggests that Russia was the aggressor with the instigation of the US and a number of its allies in a crisis that now affects millions of innocent people, with a significant percentage of Muslim citizens also impacted on both sides. Muslim citizens in Ukraine and Muslim citizens in Russia. Russia has a significant Muslim population. It is also a fact that the multinational warmongering profiteers could care less about the welfare of the impacted citizenry on either side of this conflict. The ends justify the means in their views, the human toll be damned. Consequently, when we as Muslims weigh into these political swamps in any manner, may Allah Ta'ala bless us to weigh in as with as much spiritually protective principle as we possibly can. I concluded with two verses from the Quran, two ayat. The one that reads in translation of the meaning, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even if it be against yourselves. And then the other ayah that reads, do not allow the hatred of others, or conversely, the affinity for some to cause you to deviate from the right way. On a final note, me, from my humble perspective, using, an old saying here in the States, I ain't got no dog in this fight. My concern is for the innocent folk, the innocent flesh and blood that will be spilt on both sides. And right now, it's the innocents that have been killed in Ukraine killed and injured. My understanding is, well, the last statistic I saw was that a little over 200 casualties so far among civilians in Ukraine. Allah knows best, but these are my concerns.
Yes.
We have to be balanced. We have to be principled. We have to, especially those of us who are people of faith, we have to align ourselves as much as we possibly can with where the truth is and where justice is.
Shukran for that, Al-Haj Boateng. Just to bring you back here into the discussion. Now, there are two issues that Dr. Maxim raised, and with regard to the games that are being played, and talking about the real goal. And one of them speaking about destroying Ukraine. Now, what I would like to understand is, what would Putin gain by destroying Ukraine?
If one would recall what I had said at the beginning of our conversation, and I've stated it clearly that this is my opinion, I do not think President Vladimir Putin has any intention, or the Federative State of Russia has any intention of destroying Russia. At the moment where we are sitting, Russia has taken over the airspace of Ukraine. And with their capabilities of strikes that they can embark on with their military aircraft, if they wanted to destroy Ukraine as a country, they would have already started bombing it and doing that. To this hour, there's never been a physical attack on the infrastructure of Ukraine, and therefore that says to me, Russia has no intention of destroying Ukraine, because if they do that, what benefit will they derive out of it? Instead, my view is that Russia would rather be at peace with the inhabitants and the citizens of Ukraine in order to influence regime change in Ukraine. And as the fourth speaker, Brother Sarakan, has said earlier on, there is no holy cow in this whole process, whether it is Russia or it's the West. There's no holy cow. Each one of them has intentions of what do they want to influence Ukraine to be. Russia has its own intentions, right or wrong. And its intention, I don't think, is destroying that country. I think they want regime change there because they have realized that the current president of Ukraine and his cabinet are puppets of the West, or they align themselves more with NATO in the West. And therefore, they want to put a government that will be aligned to the Russian state. And in doing that, they cannot go and destroy and attack civilians in Ukraine and or the military. They will actually go to the extent of winning the hearts of the people in Ukraine, who we should all remember that the current regime in Ukraine toppled a democratically elected government. We should not forget that. So there are still people in Ukraine who are still scorned, who still want to see the current government being thrown out and put an alternative government. And I think that's what President Putin is trying to do. I don't think that the intention is to destroy Ukraine as a country. And we have seen no signs of them aiming to do that. We have seen as late as yesterday afternoon, that was Tuesday afternoon, that Russian soldiers and the ground forces had actually occupied and taken at least 3 major cities in Ukraine. And where they were met with resistance, they will hold back and actually surround the city and close it up, but not attack and destroy the city. If they wanted to do that, they would have already destroyed the villages and the suburban areas that they've passed in going to the major cities. So I don't think Russia has any intention of destroying the country. But if they do, my view is that it will not benefit, actually, to create bigger problems for Russia itself. We know the gas and economic influence that Ukraine has towards that whole region, and I don't think it will be a wise move to destroy it economically or infrastructurally.
Thank you for that, Boateng. Ashraf, if you could unmute your mic now. Just following up from what Boateng is saying, and we know when the pro-Russian president was removed from power, this is where Vladimir Zelensky was elected. Now, at that point in time, and this is something that we see emerging, we're talking about a term neo-Nazis that is now starting to emerge. Now, at that point in time, when President Zelensky was elected, the New York Times made a statement saying that the United States and the European Union have embraced the revolution in Ukraine another flowering of democracy, and also a blow to the kleptocracy of the Soviet Union. But also at the same time, we've heard, and according to the Russians, that there are grim realities on the ground, where the United States, the EU, NATO, they sponsored this coup d'etat, which was in blatant violation of international law, and the forbidden truth that it was engineered by the West. It was a carefully staged covert operation, and the formation of a proxy regime integrated by neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. Now, this has come out of the out of the New York Times. Now, this is obviously serious because, considering what has happened in Europe in the past, considering what has happened in the world wars, considering what has happened at the time of Hitler, the Holocaust, the talk of neo-Nazis, all this is starting to surface once again as far as Ukraine is concerned.
Yes, thank you, Inaya. Thank you, fellow panelists. The big signature issues for the 21st century, one of the leading sociologists, I think Noam Chomsky, said that the signature substantive issues for the 21st century is going to be around refugees, around racism, and around borders. And I think it's quite clear what this current Ukraine conflict has done. But what is it? It has also showed up NATO and particularly the EU. If colleagues recall, just yesterday, for instance, Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that Britain will accept around 200,000 Ukrainian refugees. Now, if you contrast that to 10 years of the Conservative Party in the UK, they did not admit not more than 5,000 Syrian refugees, for instance. During the Syrian civil war, you had hundreds of thousands of refugees, and I think Germany alone received about 150,000 of those. If you look at a few months ago, last year, there were movement of refugees from Greece, Turkey into Eastern Europe, and there, some of those refugees, Syrians and Turks, found themselves literally in no man's land, in a border, in a situation that even the United Nations found quite concerning, where Bulgaria, Poland, Ukraine, all these Eastern European nations refuse to actually absorb these Syrian and Kurdish refugees. And I think that is the heart of the discourse around 21st century conflicts, where race and ethno identities are going to be the key markers of these conflicts. Globally, there are 55 million refugees, of which the majority are from Africa and Middle East, North Africa. They composed a very, very difficult, amongst the most miserable, most exploited category of people on the planet. And yet the UN Charter ostensibly protects refugees. And I think this few days, more than anything else, we've seen one of the most disturbing pictures. It reminds one of World War II even, where refugees are categorized around race, around religion and culture. And this goes against the very values of the UN and the European Union. And I think even in mainstream Europe, they're very concerned that, look, in Poland and Bulgaria, they are turning away African and Asian refugees. And so what we're beginning to see in this conflict especially is that the Christian or Judeo-Christian civilization is given the very top or apex of the hierarchies and preferences. Israel, for instance, said that they would accept 10,000 Ukrainian Jews, no one else. And so what we're beginning to see is a very concerning, if you're in the global south, if you're African, if you're Asian, if you're Middle Eastern, you should be concerned that this is the structural racism that's emanating in conflicts. You see it in Burma and Myanmar. The Rohingyas being the most isolated peoples in the planet. They are dispersed across that part of the world, in Bangladesh, in North India, and they occupy a very vulnerable space without any services, no socioeconomic rights, very little political rights. And I believe more than anything else, this conflict firstly exposes the West, especially the EU and the US, the racism emerging, particularly from East European nations who are accepted. They have all signed on the European Human Rights Charter, and they are in violation of the EU Charter. Yet they are members of the EU. So it's exposing a lot of fault lines. And it's about this nationalism that emerged during Brexit and the Trump era, whether it's the borders in Mexico, borders in the US, spatial apartheid in the inner cities in the US, in Mexico. And this, according to leading sociologists, is going to be the big debate of the 21st century. And I think this conflict is going to expose these fissures, that humanitarianism is now being modeled on religious, ethnic, cultural lines. And as a South Africans, more than any other nation in the world who has fought apartheid, we should be at the forefront of challenging this discourse. We should come out with solutions at the UN level. And we should also look at the African continent. Sadly, I mean, at any given time, there's 7 or 8 major civil wars now in Africa. We have a dire situation in Swaziland, Eswatini, on our doorstep. In my view, that is as tragic as Ukraine. But what has the South African government done? Really, there was live ammunition that the Swazi monarch killed 42 civilians a few months ago. And yet, we have not even declared that, for instance, if you look at it critically, we have not even used any UN instruments. We opt for dialogue and talks. And so South Africans themselves, as a government, needs to do introspection. Northern Mozambique is a site of serious conflict around oil and gas. Yet the South African government is actually quite quiet, except for peace summits. And then there's Ethiopia and Sudan, etc., etc. So really, I do believe race, refugees, borders, conflict, these are going to be the substantive issues that's going to define this century, because in a world where there is globalization, migration and conflict and refugees are going to be a permanent feature of global society, of regional society, and we need to find new kinds of solutions. And I think this Ukrainian conflict, what it has done is expose this underbelly of structural ethno-racism in the EU, and especially amongst those Eastern European states. They have been showed up. And even worse, Great Britain, Prime Minister Johnson in particular, by making that statement, he has clearly shown that the white Christian race is given predominance in terms of refugees over everyone else. So it's the West, the white Anglo-Saxon West versus the rest. And it's back to the old days of the third world that is always going to be left on their own. And this is where the debate should take place.
Well, we thank you for that, Ashraf, and I'd like to bring Dr. Maxim back into the discussion. Now, Dr. Maxim, the point that you had made in terms of one of the goals was obviously to sacrifice Ukraine, and the issue that I had raised with Ashraf Patel was regard to the COVID operations that was staged, the proxy regime that was installed with the aid of the United States of America and the EU as well, where on the other hand, the pro-Russian president was removed from power. And just looking at it from a leadership perspective and looking at the standoff, you mentioned the Cold War and the resurgence of the Cold War. Now, we know there has been a standoff between Russia and America for a very, very long time. And using a country like Ukraine in this proxy war, but at the same time, looking at the leadership in those countries. One leader who has been friendly to the Russians has been removed. Another leader who is friendly to the United States of America and its geopolitical interests has now been installed in power. Would you say that that could be one of the main or one of the most critical issues in this latest developments that are taking place in Ukraine? I think Dr. Maxim, I think, has gone offline for some reason or the other. We're going to try and get hold of him. Perhaps, Alhaj Mori, if you could possibly just, answer some of these issues, looking at countries, in terms of installation of proxy regimes. We've seen it in the past. We've seen it happen in many places right across the entire world, where you are looking at a country like Egypt, for instance, as well, where we see democratically elected leader like we've seen Mohamed Morsi that was removed from power, and then you had a pro-friendly West and also a pro-friendly Israel leader in the form of Sisi that was installed. So this is not the first time that it's happened. It's not only happening in the Ukraine, it's been happening all the time.
There's a bit of irony here, in the sense that, the phenomenon of proxy wars is something that was endemic, for the whole of the, latter half of the 20th century. I mean, the so-called Cold War that unfolded between, the former USSR and the United States and their respective allies was not a Cold War at all. There were hot wars that were raging in different parts of the world through proxies, with the human and material destruction that came along with it. So proxy wars, this is not anything new. With that said, I also view this, what's happening right now in that part of Europe through the lens of a human rights perspective. There's a tremendous amount of irony in two things. One, the value that is being placed on blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white-skinned Europeans versus the devastation that has taken place among Black and brown people in different parts of the globe. There's irony in the fact, and this is for me a very painful irony, having operated for as long as I have in the trenches of human rights work. Right now, Ukrainians are being celebrated for their resistance to an occupier. They are being celebrated for engaging in resistance violence and, for the use of Molotov cocktails and whatever else they can access in order to resist an occupation. They're being celebrated for this for years, post 9/11, even before 9/11. But the September 11th, that tragedy legitimized what had already been going on. For years now, I have witnessed the devastation that has come to the lives of individuals, of Muslims, the vast majority of them young Muslims, and also brothers who were connected to human rights, not human rights, but humanitarian relief organizations, doing phenomenal work in different parts of the globe, but especially in places like occupied Palestine, and them being set upon simply because the government accused them of engaging in a quote unquote conspiracy to either commit acts of terrorism or to give support to those who were engaged in a conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. And I have witnessed how, many of these very, very young Muslims would, of different tribes, would end up getting, long sentences, decades long, sometimes life sentences for an aspirational offense that never happened, often orchestrated through a government paid agent provocateur. You have this reality. You have this devastation that has taken place in countries like America, and versus, again, how folks over there in Europe are being celebrated for their violent resistance against an occupation. We're seeing how the power of propaganda and the power of that comes through the manipulation of images, the manipulation of narratives that the powers that be favor versus those that it doesn't favor. And so for me, this stands out from a human rights perspective.
Yes, and also I think just what stands out from a human rights perspective, and I'd like to pose this to Botseng, is the true colors of Europe is starting to show. And when one looks at huge question marks that are raised against some of the comments that has come through from mainstream media, and Ashraf has alluded to some of them. And this raises a question as to what is the worth in the eyes of Europe of a person of color, of a person who is considered possibly an ethnic minority, of someone from Africa, of someone from the Middle East. Because when one looks at these comments, I mean, the BBC talking about, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
That's right.
When we see the CBS News saying this isn't Iraq or Afghanistan, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European city. When we see French TV talking about it's an important question, we're not talking here about Syrians fleeing, we're talking about Europeans. ITV UK talking about the unthinkable has happened. This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. And NBC News saying, to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from Ukraine. These are Christians. They are white. They are similar to us. And the Daily Telegraph saying that they seem so like us. This is what is so shocking. Ukraine is a European country. It's people who watch Netflix, who have Instagram accounts. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote populations. Now, clearly, this raises many, many questions. The racist overturns, the racist connotation as far as this war has taken, and how mainstream media in the West is looking at this conflict. But saying,
Brother Nayet, I do not know why the African people, the Arabs and Muslims, the Hindus and Asian people are still surprised about how white people, particularly Europeans, are racist. And we should call racism what is racism. We should also recall, as the world citizens, that actually racism was invented by white people, particularly the Europeans. They invented racism. They occupied Asia, they occupied Africa, they occupied Latin America, and their greatest tool was racism. They looked at the pigmentation and the color of the skin of the people of those countries they occupied. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me that the so-called tried and trusted media, Western, all the media houses that you have mentioned, they couldn't hold back their racist status towards the African people, towards the Muslims or Arabs, or towards the Asians. They could not. It is within them. Racism runs in the bloods and veins of white people. And we should not concern ourselves with that. We should concern ourselves as African people on how we react towards the conduct and the behavior of people who are preaching Christianity, who are preaching, democracy, who are preaching things like they are civilized nations. So if you look at what the BBC has said, and CNN and others, they are simply saying it is common and it's normal for Africans to get into wars and kill each other or be killed. It is common and normal for Arabs to get into wars and be killed and be attacked by Americans and Europeans with joint forces like NATO. And it's common cause. Therefore, we should not expect that any country in Europe, whether it's Eastern Europe or Western Europe, can end up in a civil war or can end up into a battle. I mean, we are sitting, me and you and the colleagues today, on social media. We are communicating through social media. We have access to Netflix and all those things they've mentioned, as if African people do not have those things. That is the narrow mind of the European people when they look at other countries. That's why they are trying to lay as much possible countries on the Eastern Bloc to can join them so that they can brainwash them, so that they can instill into those people the racism that has entrenched them to be the so-called Western powers. And I think as African people, we should thank actually people like President Putin. We have seen his historical background. We have seen how he conducted himself from a military personnel and Air Force, jet flyer. We have seen how Putin himself as a person has participated into the liberation of the African states, particularly in the former frontline states, which are known as SADC today. Whether Russia had interest or not at that time, it's immaterial. But we are sitting as an African continent. We don't even have a single country out of all the 53 or 54 member states that has been occupied, colonized, oppressed by the Russian people. And history is talking to itself. As much as I may sit here and think Russian people are racist, we have seen the atrocities of the Ukrainians, the Polish, and the other neighboring states of what has happened in the last few days, whereby African people or people of color were put backwards in humanitarian crisis. So I do not know where is the United Nations in this instance when it is happening clearly in front of the UN. The racism that was raised yesterday by the South African ambassador to the United Nations to say we cannot put a blind eye that the children of Palestine are still being killed today. The children of the DRC are still being killed today. By who? By NATO influenced, supported, and funded forces. And the world thinks it is normal that children in Syria, children in South Asia, children in southern part of Africa are dying every day. Unarmed civilians dying because of ammunition distributed by NATO and its allies. The Americans themselves, 2 days ago, they mentioned how they will send arms to the Ukrainians in order to defend their country. And I've said it at the opening remarks. How do you give an unmilitarized, untrained person arms? Those arms will end up with the children of Ukraine killing each other. But the racism in this world is actually being entrenched by the media houses that you have mentioned. And I think African people, Arabs, as well as Asians must start departing and listening to the influence and the brainwash of these media houses. And in conclusion, colleagues, I had indicated to the producer of the show that I was going to be with you, unfortunately, for just an hour. And I am going to sincerely beg yourselves as well as your listeners to allow me to can go to other engagements. I would have loved to stay longer, but I've got other pre-arranged engagements. And please bear with me and with the common understanding. I'm enjoying the conversation. It's well brought, and I think I'm sitting with a panel of well-informed, well-traveled people. And please excuse me if it's allowed. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Well, Botsang, thank you very much for that, and we do appreciate you taking time out, talking to us, and although it's been for the hour, we would have loved to have you, but we do understand you've got other commitments, you've got other engagements as well, and we appreciate you taking time out and spending the last hour in the company of our viewers and listeners at Salam Media. We wish you all the best, and once again, we thank you sincerely for your time, for your input, and for unpacking this very, very important discussion that we are having tonight. Yes, sadly, Botsang Moloya has had to leave us, but we will still continue. I believe Dr. Maxim Razumyi is back online with us. Dr. Maxim, good evening to you once again. Can you hear me? Well, I think we are definitely having problems. Ashraf, we're going to continue with you. And I think just, Ashraf, you made, certain points earlier on when we were talking about the whole question surrounding racism as well. But also at the same time, when one looks at the language of Western media, when we look at, for instance, headlines that are telling the world, your blood, your lives, your honor is worth less to us than that of a civilized European with blonde hair and blue eyes. When they're telling the world that Muslim resistance to foreign occupation or oppression carried out by the likes of NATO, by the likes of the United States, India, Israel, we talk about Kashmir and Palestine, and also Russia, when they say it is deemed to be as terrorism, while we see the resistance of the Ukrainians at this point in time being talked about a brave nation. They are being lionized, standing up against oppression, where we see the BBC has even celebrated brave Ukrainian women making Molotov cocktail bombs. But we haven't seen the same sentiments expressed by Kashmiris, by Palestinians, by Syrians. We see the women with their children who continue bravely resisting with rocks and stones.
Yes, Inayat, good conversation. Look, we've been part of media development for the last 20 years. And then the big names, Noam Chomsky, John Pilger, these names and many others, Ziauddin Sardar, they have articulated the media as a superstructure. So there was a sociologist called Louis Althusser in the 70s when he unpacked imperialism or capitalism. He looked at the different instruments of the ruling classes. And obviously one was military, the other was trade, economy, technology. But the fifth or sixth pillar was media, mass media. And mass media in an information age, in a social media rich age, is the most phenomenal, influential power that is deployed by the power structures. And we've seen it in the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan 20 years ago. We're seeing it now. What is quite clear is that there is a concentration of media ownership amongst the top corporations. I think Al-Hajj will be able to say that in the US, the top 5 media big tech corporations literally run the politics and run the economic discourse in the US. Like, for instance, Washington Post is owned by Amazon, Jeff Bezos, for instance. There's one example. And we can go on and on. And what is very important for ordinary citizens is to look at alternative media. And there are a range of alternative media outlets. And I think human rights, but not just human rights as a standalone, human rights rooted in social justice. I think that is the real human rights. And that's where we should get all alternative news. But I think we need to look at, sadly, the situation in the developing world, especially Africa and South Asia. These are still amongst the poorest nations in the world. If you look at the bottom billion, as they are called, they are about 2.5 billion of the poorest citizens in the planet, and they occupy large chunks of Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, and they are the people of the South, and they are cut out of the economic system in terms of unfair trade, in terms of investment that benefits large corporations, the EU, the US, emerging China and Russia. They're also very dominant in the economic, and maybe perhaps they're trying to counterbalance the trade. For instance, the BRICS group is one formation trying to infuse some sort of multilateralism in the global pecking order. There are successes in many ways, and there have been challenges. But for me, the sad situation is just the state of Africa. The Africa Union, on paper, it's fantastic. We have the Africa Charter of Human Rights. We have the AU Agenda 2063, which is a fantastic document. We've done a lot of work on it. We have now the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, which is also in operation. But sadly, the more we see of all these exciting documents and initiatives, I just see many of the African leaders reduce to a third-class citizenship. Even our leaders, they have to go to Europe. There was the Africa-EU summit in Brussels, for instance, 2 weeks ago. And the biggest debate was vaccine access. And yet the EU and the US did not give African nations the right to manufacture the vaccines. They've talked about it for a year. Africa is the most under-vaccinated on the planet. UK, Europe, France, they've got doses that far exceeds their population. UK has 150 million doses of vaccines, Germany as well. Their populations are only 60 million, but yet they are not giving Africa the patents to manufacture the vaccines. Fortunately, China and Russia, to their credit, donated a lot of vaccines to Africa. And that was in good faith in terms of that solidarity. There may be some challenges here and there, but I think there is a pecking order, a global pecking order. And sadly, African leaders, the more larger powers show interest in Africa, we find African leaders playing the game. You know, it's called forum shopping. There's China Africa, there's Russia Africa summits, there's EU Africa, there's US in Africa, there's India in Africa, there's Turkey in Africa, there's Saudi Arabia in Africa. All these medium powers are showing an interest in Africa. African leaders are playing the game because there's money. Wherever there's money, there's investment. The leaders would act in an elitist mode. They would be opportunistic. They would, wherever there's investments, they would then create conditions for that. And there's a lot of clientelism. Clientelism is basically keep the resources flowing amongst the top 10% of society. And you see it. You go to Nairobi, you go to Ghana, you go to Cairo, you go to Namibia, in South Africa as well. So the bigger challenge is self-reflection. And we all know the great African leaders from Nkumura to Julius Nyerere to Steve Biko, Mandela. They've all talked about this need for African agency. How can Africans define their own values in a competitive global world? I think Thabo Mbeki with the Africa Renaissance Project was one very positive project. And sadly, that is losing its value and currency in a very competitive world. But the idea was good. I think Mbeki was passionate about African development, but he played within the global economic structure that didn't allow space for that to develop. But today, 15 years later, the situation is worse. So we should be quite concerned. You know, the AU has something called the AU's program called Silencing the Guns. And that's the AU Peace and Security Agenda. And that was signed about 7 years ago. And believe you me, when the AU Peace and Security Charter was signed 7 years or 8 years ago, there were only 2 or 3 major conflicts. Today, 2022, we have 12 to 15 active civil wars, conflicts, refugees, borders, you name it, DRC, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Western Sahara. No one has talked about Western Sahara. The Moroccan invasion of Western Sahara is more brutal than anything you see today. And yet it's out of the news. And yet it's in Africa. And yet as Africans, we don't talk about it. The situation in Eswatini is completely blacked out. There's no social media. Human rights activists, labor unionists are completely detained, as brutal as the old apartheid regime. And yet South Africa as a democratic state cannot act decisively. You know, so we should zone in my view, we should have 10% discussion on Ukraine and 90% discussion on Eswatini, Mozambique, DRC, Sudan, Western Sahara. And we should find solidarities, particularly in the US. Al-Hajj will say, the African American community, the Black Lives Matter. We should be connecting with those struggles because they are all common, because they are rooted in racism. They are rooted in structural racism that we are suffering today. They are rooted in the politics of race and ethnocentricity that is dominating the US mainstream, that is dominating European mainstream. The rise of ethno-white supremacy is mainstream. Forget neo-Nazis are the small part of the problem. It's mainstream racism that is dominating US politics today. It's mainstream racism that's dominating UK and European politics today. And they are going to use economic and military muscle and incentives to stop the development of the natural development of regions like Africa and Asia. The situation is dire and there needs to be new kind of thinking and approaches. That would be my point of view.
Yes, Ashraf. And also, Al-Hajj, I think what is important for us to understand is, and I think you made mention of it right up front, that as Muslims, in terms of how we need to react. And as Muslims, we should react and respond differently to the crisis. Yes, we feel sorry. We must sympathize with any injustices that are taking place, any human rights violations that are taking place, any unnecessary killing of innocent people, rendering people homeless and the like. And I know you've been at the forefront today, and I'd like to make special mention, being March the 2nd, it is the birthday of Dr. Afia Siddiqui. And I know you've been at the forefront of the Afia campaign in the United States of America. And all of this put together, the key issue here is it's about speaking out. It's about speaking out against injustices that are taking place. And how often, Al-Hajj Maurice Salakan, have we seen Muslims being criminalized when they try to help oppressed people? We've seen it when they've tried to help people in Syria, in Palestine, in Libya, and whether it is also just humanitarian causes, delivering life-saving aid, where we've seen Muslims losing even their citizenship in certain European countries for being humanitarians and for assisting people in need. Yet, we've seen the latest with the Ukraine crisis. We've seen the UK foreign minister making a statement that she absolutely supports individual Britons traveling to fight in Ukraine. And we've seen this call made through globally by some of the other European nations as well, Al-Hajj.
That's right. And, you contrast that, my brother, with young, idealistic, often emotionally disturbed Muslims in the West who get set upon by a government-paid agent provocateur who encourages them to think along these lines, to begin to talk along these lines. Okay, let's think about, going over to Syria or going to Yemen or going to occupied Palestine or going to Afghanistan or Iraq and engaging in jihad, to free our brothers and sisters. I mean, you can have individuals, and I've seen so many cases like this, that are manipulated into speaking like this. And they end up being rounded up after they've said just enough to be able to justify an indictment, taken through a federal court, and then given outrageous sentences for aspirational offenses. Again, we're seeing the dichotomy, the tremendous amount of difference between how individuals coming from a certain racial and a socio-political bloc are treated versus others. With that said, I agree with everything my brother just said, especially as it pertains to the issue of, the need for courageous, principled, alternative media. We have an individual who has since passed on. His name was Walter Williams. He was considered, he was the dean of the School of Journalism at the University of Missouri in the early part of the 20th century. And he is viewed as the dean of American journalism. He drafted something called the Journalist's Creed. And I shared this in a short piece of video with Salam Media a few days back. There's one line in this creed that is a very powerful call for clean, principled journalism. There is one line that reads, I believe that advertising, news, and editorial columns should alike serve the best interests of readers, that a single standard of helpful truth and cleanness should prevail for all. Now, if journalism, both print and broadcast journalism, functioned in this way, in the land that likes to call itself the land of liberty and justice for all, we would have a very different America. But unfortunately, it doesn't. We do have, the occasional network or the occasional publication that tries to align itself with these principles, but the vast majority are all about, the bottom line and whatever it takes to increase the bottom line. And this is what compromises us. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, He would not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. And subhanAllah, what the brother said about the compromise, the unprincipled compromise, the surrender of principle, the in the interests of, what can I get out of this, that we find among so many quote unquote leaders in the quote unquote developing world. It weighs heavy on the heart when we see how they are willing to compromise themselves and compromise the interests of their people and their nations, for the benefit of those who dangle, the money and the trinkets of material power before them. It's really sad. If the leaders, many of whom have been killed off, have been assassinated, if those leaders, were alive and still with us and able to guide the future of their people and their nations as they were attempting to do when their lives were taken, the continent, the African continent, the Asian continent, the Arab lands would be far different and more positively different than they are today. But we've got to struggle and we have to try to invest as much zeal for principled struggle in the generations coming behind us, the generations that are coming up right now, in order to try to turn this around. If we don't, heaven help us all, as Stevie Wonder was known to say in one of his memorable songs, heaven help us all.
Yes, and I think we are obviously heading towards the end of this broadcast now. Ashraf, I think just to summarize in terms of what we have been discussing for the last hour and a half as well, and I think what this war in Ukraine is telling us is the response of the Western nations is clear. It is a clear example of how little the current order has to offer. When we look at the current world order, we're looking at the secular world order, we're looking at a capitalist world order as well, because there are many other underlying issues that have been playing out in the background, but it's also at the same time a reminder to us in exposing the current hypocrisies that are existing. And I think, just some final thoughts on your side, where we see this hypocrisy, where we see these double standards that are playing out. We're talking about this blatant racist saga that has been unfolding. And at the end of the day, as Muslims, this is in our nature, this is our value system, where we in the past, and as Maurice Salakan has spoken about leadership in the past, where we've produced civilizations, and more importantly, our role is to contribute and to make a positive change wherever we are, in whatever continent we are, under what conditions we are.
Yes, thank you, Inayat. Thank you, Brother Salakan. These points are very relevant and important. And the most important thing is history is always marching on. There's no stagnation.
That's right.
And we got to look at history in a context. And so the most powerful projection of media and how they frame an event is they would zone in on a conflict like Ukraine, and you would, as the listener or viewer, if you don't have a critical mind, you would think that is the only conflict happening in the world today,
right.
And that is the only conflict that matters. I mean, we have not even realized that in the same few days, while the Ukrainian situation, and honestly, the way I thought every day there were 1,000 or 5,000 people being killed, that was my understanding in how the media was enraged. And today, when I saw the news, the figure is not more than 250. Fine, those 250 lives are very important and they must be mourned. But in the same situation, you've had things happening in Burma, in Mali, in Western Sahara, in Mozambique, in the DRC. Just yesterday, about 55 people were killed in some conflict. Now, these are huge numbers, but they would not make the headline news because those countries are out of the global economic order. Most of African countries are merely commodity producers in terms of mining and agriculture. And that's all. And it goes to the north, it gets processed there, and value is added there and resold back to the world. And so if you're not in the value chains, as they say, of the economic order, politically you're right at the bottom of the pyramid. And so as Africans...
sorry, can I just stop you there? I've just
Yes.
seen a message come through.
Sure.
I see Dr. Maxim Rozumyi is back with us. Dr. Maxim, good evening to you once again.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you were able to join us, and we were about to end the broadcast, but I'm glad you were able to join us. And an issue that I required clarity on earlier or just before you went offline is one of the statements that you had made with regard to Ukraine, and you said that, Ukraine being sacrificed, that has been one of the goals and the aims. And the question I had raised is with regards to the proxy war that is being fought between the United States and Russia, and using Ukraine to achieve other objectives and other stated goals or self-interest that both the United States of America, NATO, the EU, and Russia may have had. And I just needed your thoughts with regards to Ukraine and caught in the middle of this entire saga that is playing out between the United States, the EU, NATO, and Russia.
Yeah, thank you. The only way for Ukrainian people to save their dignity, their identity, maybe their life, is to join Western civilization and to break any defense from Russia. But regarding to the main topic of discussion, geopolitical landscape and forecast of global trends, and regarding to the very important issues mentioned my colleagues, participants of this discussion, I just like to give you a small story about the factor of ideas in the actual situation in our world. You talked about media. You talked about opinion and conscience and so on, but the main factor of development of these spheres is our ideas. I mean, for example, idea which used of Russian propaganda now. They blamed Ukraine as Nazis or fascists or something like that, and it's very interesting example just to understand what's happened in our world nowadays, because it looks like it's possible to bring idea very strange idea to a mind of people of whole country. I mean Russia. Ukraine. They blamed Ukraine as Nazis or something like that. But now, when they started to denazification, as they call, we have President Jew. They want to protect Russian-speaking people, and our president is Russian-speaking, and it doesn't matter for Russian propaganda. It doesn't matter for Russian people. They believe that their troops are going to make right things in Ukraine. I just want to draw your attention to the role of ideas and ideology in the modern world. A lot of problems, a lot of aspects you mentioned in your speeches have deep roots in history, in previous ideologies and so on. But now we have the period when new ideologies, new ideas can be input in the mind of millions of people, and even access to the mass media, to the social media, cannot stop this process of new ideologies and new fanatics, and they can change our world in a very short period. That's the idea I'd like to bring to this discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, we are obviously heading towards closure, and we're just going to go around and with the panel and just get some final thoughts, starting with you, Al-Haj Maurice Alakan. Just final thoughts on what we have been talking about.
Okay, I would simply like to remind the viewers and listeners and my distinguished panel and respected moderator to an observation that was made by a revolutionary psychiatrist from Martinique, one of the voices of one of the most bloody and important revolutions of the 20th century, the Algerian Revolution, none other than Dr. Frantz Fanon. In his book entitled Wretched of the Earth, he said, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. This is especially significant for the younger generation that is looking at this world as it is, trying to find their way and searching for those that are not really searching. There's a need for us to search for what it is, what our purpose is in life, and what the need is for whatever we can contribute toward making the world a better place, beginning with our immediate world, wherever we happen to be. Each generation has a responsibility to accept the baton for the struggle for positive change. And may Allah Ta'ala bless those who embrace this.
Ameen. Jazakallah khairan. Ashraf, final thoughts from you. If you could unmute, please, Ashraf.
Yes. So in the spirit of Brother Salakan and others, colleagues, Dr. Maxim and Mr. Dr. Malloy, in my view, yes, the marker of the 21st century again is going to be around this battle of civilizations. there is a Western-centric neoliberal order, but that order is in a slight decline. The unipolar domination of the US structurally is coming to a closure. Not that it won't be significant, but what we're beginning to see is rise of other powers. Eurasia being a very important region in the world, and some scholars are saying this conflict is a battle for Eurasia, to shape the future of Eurasia, and NATO and the EU needs to get stronghold states in Eurasia to roll back the power of the East. And the real power, basically, Russia is an important power, regional power, and in many ways it has some elements of global power, but really the real power is China. The real countervailing power to the West is China in every department, economic, political, military, development, and in every major indicator, it is matching the West, and in some cases, it's even beating the West in the area of technology, for instance, in the area of infrastructure. And it has one thing going that no other nation in the world has, that no significant economic power has done what China has done. In one, it has developed its population, 600 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. No nation in history has achieved those targets. Secondly, it has done this without any colonization. It hasn't occupied any power. It has never been in a conflict in the last 75 years. It has definitely been part of proxy wars in Vietnam and other regions, but it hasn't occupied any power except Tibet, for instance. Now, if you were to unpack that, this would be, one can say, the balance shifting. And Eurasia, Russia, East Europe, the real power broker that has the significant resources in terms of infrastructure, markets, it has a surplus of $2 or $3 trillion. It has infrastructure plans, and it is quietly going and expanding its soft power across borders in Africa, in Latin America, in every significant market. And it's doing this without any conflict or any military personnel on the ground. And I think that is the significant factor that will propel China into world power status in the next 15 or 20 years. And if you see its behavior, it's responding very cool to the Russian situation. It has given Russia some support, but not all. And it is trying to maintain relations with all the major powers, be it the US, be it the Europeans, be it Asia and Russia and Eurasia. It's balancing all its interests in an optimal way. And this will pave the way for its move into world power status. And I think this is the lesson from the Ukrainian conflict. The growth of Eurasia, but China will underpin this power structure going forward. And the West needs to find how it's going to match that model, because currently the West has failed to come with a developmental model that the third world could follow. And it seems China's model is succeeding on all the major economic and development indicators. And I think this would be the platform going forward for the next 20 to 50 years.
Shukran for that, Ashraf. Just final thoughts from you, Dr. Maxim. We know your country is in crisis at this point in time, but what would be the best way out of this crisis?
The best way to solve this.
Dr. Maxim, you're sounding very, very faint. We can barely hear you. If you could up your levels, please.
Okay, I'll try to speak loudly. The best way is to stop Russian troops. I think we must use mediation from some countries. It looks like Turkish president can be this mediator who can do it. and I hope that it must happen very soon. If not, if it doesn't happen very soon, this conflict, this war can destroy European order, European life of European people, and it can destroy not only peace but also economical growth and so on and so on. So I hope that superpowers come to the round table and decided what to do with Russia after they attack Ukraine. And the main position would be from China is the main factor in this game. If we're talking about the game, China is waiting what's going on, what happened with Ukraine, and then they must do their step to protect their interests. If we will see the new compromise between West and China, Russia will lose all of its power in very short period. Maybe it couldn't save their regions and so on. I think it's very it's result what we're waiting for. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Maxim, and also to you, Ashraf Patel, Alhaj Maurice Alakan. We do appreciate all of you taking time out and being part of this panel discussion on Salam Media on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi. It's been an absolute pleasure having all of you as part of the panel. We wish you well, and please take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition, and this is the big talking point right across the entire world, Russia and what is taking place in Ukraine. But I think in summary, there are many lessons, and there are many issues that we have unpacked, and we need to take note of what we have unpacked, because at the time of crisis, we must still continue contributing in a positive way. We need to convey the message, the correct message, and more importantly, to highlight and to speak out against injustices and oppression, irrespective of who is responsible for them. And with that, I'm going to be signing off from myself and the team that has put this program together. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.